All right, so this is 4.7. Hopefully this is a pretty easy section for you. We're not going to be doing anything new, just applying it differently. And so when you finish today, the student will be able to describe the transformations of polynomial functions and write transformations of polynomial functions. So back earlier in the year, remember we did a lot with transformations. And we had two basic things we did. We either did horizontal or we did vertical. And remember, horizontal affects just x, where vertical, it affects f of x, the whole function. And also remember with horizontal, it's the inverse of what it says. So if it says plus 2, it's really a negative 2. If it says times 3, it's a multiplicative inverse, which would be 1/3. And so on page 206 in the Big Ideas Math, if we go to that, it has some examples here for you. And so this is on page 206. It's a core concept. So horizontal, remember horizontal just affects the x. So it would be x minus h. So an example would be x minus 5. Remember, it's opposite what it says. Horizontal is left and right, so that's 5 units right. Plus 2 would be 2 units left. If we do a vertical translation, then it's outside the function. It affects the whole thing. So x to the 4th plus 1 would be up 1, and x to the 4th minus 4 would be 4 down. Reflections, remember reflections either flip vertically or horizontally. Vertically would be up and down, so that's over the x-axis, and horizontally would be left and right, so that's over the y-axis. So in this case, it's negative x, it just affects the x, so that's horizontal, so it's over the y-axis. You will have to simplify these, so even though you put negative x to the 4th, it ends up back to x to the 4th if we started with x to the 4th. A negative f of x, now it affects the whole thing, so it's over the x-axis, and that would be negative x to the 4th. Horizontal stretch and shrink, remember stretches are when it's greater than 1, and shrinks are when it's less than 1. You don't worry about the negative sign because that's taken care of with reflections. So if we have 2, remember horizontal is the inverse of what it says, so instead of times 2, then it's really 1/2, the reciprocal of that, and so it's a shrink by a factor of 1/2, a horizontal shrink. If it's 1/2, then again the reciprocal of that would be 2, and so that would be a stretch by a factor of 2. Vertical stretch or shrink, now it affects the whole function. So now it is what it says it is, so 8x to the 4th would be a vertical stretch of 8, and g of x is 1/4 x to the 4th would be a vertical shrink of 1/4. So if we look at some examples, so they're going to give you a function and then ask you to describe the transformation that took place. So in this case, if you just take it one at a time, so the plus 5, since it's inside the parentheses, it affects just the x. So that would be opposite that, so that would be left 5, and a positive 2 is outside the parentheses, so that would be up 2. So if you'll try this one and then come back and see if you did it right. So this is x to the 4th. So the minus 3 is inside, so that would be the opposite of that would be plus 3 or right 3. And then minus 1 is outside, so that would be down 1. So hopefully you got that right. Now they're going to ask you to describe a graph. I don't think I have you graphing on the assignment, so don't worry about that, but I'll show you what they're looking for. And if you graph them, you don't have to be exact. So on this one it says negative 1/4. So the negative sign, again, it's outside of the x, so it doesn't affect just the x. If it affected just the x, it would have to be inside with the 4th on the outside. So in this case, that would be a vertical reflection. So reflects over x-axis. And then the 1/4 again is outside, so that's a vertical shrink, because it's less than 1. A vertical shrink of 1/4. So if you were to graph this is what I'd like to see on your graph. You would just put the original, and so x to the 4th would look something like this. And so what I want you to understand that it flipped over the x-axis, so it's now going down. And remember, a vertical shrink squishes it so it widens it out and makes it wider. So all I would expect to see is something like this that shows that you understand that it flipped and that it got wider. So on this one, it's x to the 5th. So now the 2 is inside, so that's horizontal. And so that's a horizontal. Now remember, it's the inverse of what it says. So that would be a shrink of 1/2, because you have to flip it over. And then the -3 is outside, so that would be down 3. And if I was to graph this, remember, if it's an odd power, that tells us that one's going up, one's going down. It's positive, so it finishes going up. So this graph might look something like this. And so what I want, horizontal shrink, so we're going to squeeze it this way, which is going to make it thinner and look like a vertical stretch. And down 3, so I would just make it thinner and move it down 3. So if you graph them, you would just type it into the graphing calculator and see what it looked like, and then just visually move it. It doesn't have to be exact. So, again, don't worry about graphing this. Let's just describe the transformation. Okay, so try it, come back, check it out. So, 4 is outside, so vertical stretch of 4. The 2 is inside, so it's the inverse of that. Plus 2 would be -2, so 2 left. And that would be it. Okay? So if you were to graph it again, it would get thinner and move 2 to the left. So as long as we understand the transformations from before, fairly easy. And you can always refer back to that chart on page 206. So the other thing they're going to do is they're going to ask you to write the new rule, and they'll get a little bit more complicated. So if you look at this one, this is our function, and it says that we're going to do -x, which means we're going to reflect it over the y-axis because we're going horizontally. So that just means when I come to x, I put -x inside the parentheses, plus -x squared plus 1. So now you're going to have to simplify this. So this would be x to the 3rd, but 3 negatives is negative, 2 negatives is positive, so plus x squared plus 1, and you'd be done. If I was to do this one, so this transformation was just a horizontal reflection over the y-axis. This would be a vertical stretch of 3, so now I take, again, this whole thing, I just put it in parentheses, and I multiply it by 3 and then simplify, so 3x cubed plus 3x squared plus 3, and we're done. So now let's look at page 208 in the book. And we're going to look at example number 3 and 4. So, 4 and 5 actually. Look at example 4 and 5 on here. So, now it gets a little bit more complicated. They add things. So this says, let the graph of G be a vertical stretch by a factor of 2. So do it one step at a time. So I take the vertical stretch of 2. So I times the whole thing by 2, which they show there. And you distribute the 2. And so we get 2x to the 4th minus 4x squared. Then we go to the next part. And it says, followed by a translation 3 units up. So that just means I'm going to take this whole thing and I'm going to add 3. And so we get this new function with plus 3. So if we take a look at 5, it tells us that this is our function, 1/3 x cubed minus 2. And we're going to do this v equals 3x. So if I was to describe that, remember it's just affecting the x, so it would be horizontal. And we do the reciprocal then, and so it would be 1/3. And so it would be a horizontal shrink of 1/3. But when they tell you what it is, it just means when you come to the function, every time you come to x, we just replace it with 3x. And then we should simplify these. So remember, you do this first, so 3 to the third, that would be 1/3, so this is going to become 27x cubed, and then minus 9x squared. And then we can multiply the 1/3 to the 27, so 3 goes into 27 9 times. So we get 9x cubed minus 9x squared, and we're done. So again, if you would try these, and then come back and check and see how you did. So we started with x to the 5th minus 4x plus 6, and we're going to do negative f of x. So that just means, again, we do the whole thing. And then simplify it, so we distribute that negative sign, and we're done. Example 4, if you did that right, it says, let the graph of g of x be a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2, and this is our function. So 8x to the 3rd plus 3. So a horizontal stretch of 2 means I'm going to take that and do the reciprocal 1/2 x. Remember, the power goes outside. So now I have to simplify this. 1/2 to the 3rd is 1/8. Oops. And then 8 times 1/8, the 8's cancel, and so you get x cubed plus 3. And then it says, followed by a translation 3 to the right. Well, remember, 3 to the right would be horizontal, so we do the inverse of that. So when I come to x, I'm going to do minus 3 to get a 3 to the right, cubed plus 3, and we're done. So, it's all about understanding the transformations, and just, again, refer to page 206. It has them all there. Hopefully you remember it from before, and it will make the assignment pretty easy. So it's on Big Ideas, and it's page 209, numbers 3 to 15, the odds, 17 to 21 all, and 23 to 26 all. So hopefully you won't have any problem with this.